Thank you.
Right, hello everybody. This afternoon we have Andrew Lumsden, who's going to be talking to us about gay news. So over to you, Andrew.
Thank you very much, Alan, and thank you to everyone at Westminster LGBT Forum for asking me to talk a bit about gay news. Nobody has asked me in 40 years, so it's something of an experience. What I thought we'd do, by agreement with Alan, was to take one issue of gay news. It ran from 1972 to 1983. We thought we'd take one issue, and this is the one one of the ones published in 1981, and just look at different parts of the paper, including the cast list, the people who actually brought it out, and try to bring to life a bit what it was like to work on such a paper and the kind of ground it covered. It was called Gay News because when it started in 1972, gay signified what in the 1980s was reinvented as LGBT and LGBT+. So gay covered, as the Gay Liberation Front did, from which Gay News came, gay news signified LGBT, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transsexual, and any variations. So, shall we see the front page of that issue in July 1991? So there we are on the left, that's the front page of the paper. And it's the young man on the cover was a novelist and an American. And the novel he wrote, called Reflections of a Rock Lobster, concerned how he'd gone to a high school prom in America as a teenager. And instead of taking a young woman from the high school, as was the compulsory tradition, he had taken his boyfriend. And as a result of that experience, he wrote a novel. I might mention here that one of the very significant people in all the years of gay news was called Michael Mason, and he was besotted with this character from the photograph. And Michael was news editor, and I just want to say very swiftly that he went on to found a paper that many, I hope, will have heard of. He decided there needed to be even faster news delivery to LGBT people than once a fortnight, which Gay News was. He decided it ought to be weekly, but really couldn't handle more than the London area plus Brighton, couldn't hope to go national. And with one of the Gay News reporters, Graham McKerrow, they founded Capital Gay, which lasted for many years and is credited as the first periodical of any description in the world to use the terms HIV and AIDS and to explain what the threat was. So we'll move on, I think, from the young man on the front cover to Smiles and Songs in the Streets. This is about about a first ever public walk through part of London by lesbians with their partners and with their allies, their friends. So men were not asked to stay away, so there are men there as well. The extraordinary thing about this, so the date, remember, is 1981. The extraordinary thing is that the Metropolitan Police arranged deliberately, so far as we know, to have women police officers accompanying the march. And it was nearly 600 people. And they were there not in order to harass these homosexuals on the streets, nor to arrest anybody if they could avoid it. They were there to make sure anybody who tried to attack the walk was prevented and arrested. When we compare that walk as an act of liberation by lesbians in 1981 with what's recently happened with the terrible photographs of women being brought to the ground by grown large policemen this year, it shows that not everything was far worse in 1981 than now. That wonderful photograph. Shall we just go on one, Alan, if we can? Now, this is the bad side, one of the innumerable bad sides, of course, also of 1981. This is a picture of the results of a dawn raid by the local police on a Brixton gay household. Brixton, a predominantly black area then, and where the black community suffered bitterly from the conduct of the police in the neighborhood. This is an example of LGBT people in the same neighborhood of Brixton. They've been raided by the police. And a raid by the police in those days meant that they hunted for diaries, photographs, anything with which they could track down other people that they thought they wanted to put onto their database. So here we are, Mead Road, is it?
Mead.
I don't think I know Mead Road in Brixton. But anyway, they're waiting in a vigil outside the police station. That's the police station at the steps. They're waiting for one of their number to be released who was arrested. And Gay News was full of stories of this sort, actions by the police, raiding parties, raiding venues. So let's try another one, if you would, Alan. I've picked on this one because it says West India visit, West Indian visit. This was a visit to London by the Jamaican Daily News and was a first, as far as we know, published by the Gay Freedom Movement of Jamaica. Many may be surprised that in 1981, there were brave and daring enough people in Jamaica and in the Caribbean to launch a gay freedom movement, and they did in Kingston in Jamaica. And Jamaican delegates came to the conference of the International Gay Association, known mostly by the initials ILGA. The huge archive of the International Lesbian and Gay Association has just gone to the Bishopsgate Institute in London, to their delight, where they're going to sort through it. So that's a significant visit. Another one, please.
Just before we move on, it's interesting also on that page, Gay Whiz, the Consenting Adults, the London-based gay theatre group. That it was the group run by Peter Scott Presland, as he now is, and now runs everything under Homo Promos. But interesting that that is still going.
It is, so it is, there
yes.
it is.
Yes.
And now we get a photograph of something that was feasible then, and of course completely impossible for the time being. This is an advertisement in the paper by an outfit called Uranian Travel, uranium being another coded word rather for gay. And Mykonos was a favorite destination in Greece for gay men in the 1970s, 1980s. Very, very cheap travel, perfectly easy to go. And it reflects something about the paper Gay News, which is, though it was for all the outlawed sexualities, Gay News had a very strong flavor of being for gay men, rather in contradiction to the print material in it. which was far wider in scope. But the advertising tended to be directed at gay men, and the paper needed advertising because the staff were being paid and people were paying for the paper. So advertising was essential. The money was with the gay men, so far as there was money in the gay community, and amongst the gay men, amongst many, there was a great deal of money. And they were being paid at the same rate as a straight man supporting a father, not a father, well, sometimes a father, but supporting children, and a wife rather prohibited by the culture then from going and earning any money for herself. So there was a constant struggle going on within the paper to try to adjust where possible away from this gay male presentation. Thank you, Alan. This is here not for the sake of those two men, two artists, but for the sake of the name above them, Emmanuel Cooper. Gay News had this long supplement of entertainment and information every fortnight. And Emmanuel Cooper was one of the consultant writers, you could really say, who was an art historian and an art critic. And one of the things that Gay News revolutionized from 1972, slowly at first, but slowly revolutionized, was that throughout the arts world and the national media and national periodicals, there were, as all the world knew then and now, there were umpteen gay and lesbian people, and trans people far less noticeably, but there too. And when Gay News began to work and be popular and reliable and coming out without missing an issue or two, as happened early on, those who were completely openly gay in the broad sense and worked for national media could at last have somewhere to write out of their own characters, knowledge, and sexuality. And they loved it. And some of the finest critics of film, theatre, ballet, literature were commissioned to write for Gay News and willingly did so. So Emmanuel Cooper, the late Emmanuel Cooper, is one of them. Well, here's the staff. A remarkable thing about Gay News, which may not have been the case for many, many years after it stopped in 1983, was that it was, by the time it was 1981, it was roughly 50-50, very near 50-50 women and men on the workforce. I'll just run down a few of these names. So many are dead and often from HIV. There's the editor and publisher, Dennis Levin. I had suggested this newspaper, I ought perhaps to say, in late 1971, because people were pouring into London to meetings of Gay Liberation Front, including from Italy and from France, and also from cities around Ireland and from Scotland and Wales and elsewhere in England. And it was very difficult for them to know what was going on if they couldn't physically be present at the meetings. There was a brilliant occasional periodical that Gay Liberation Front put out called Come Together, which was eventually published in book form. Extracts were published in book form by Gay Men's Press. But you couldn't necessarily easily get hold of Come Together, and many people missed seeing copies of it. And it was above all for revolutionary ways of thinking and living, rather than news reports. So, so I suggested we ought to have a newspaper, and a newspaper which people paid for to take it seriously, where the staff were paid, and where there was coverage of every aspect of what we could hear of that was going on. And I suggested, there were hundreds of people at the meeting, and I said, if anybody's interested in this as a project, as a nice thing to do, please let's have a word afterwards. And only one person out of the hundreds came and talked with me afterwards, and that was Dennis Lemon, who was manager of a music shop. And that was, most of us who've put up ideas at large meetings have experienced exactly that. Nothing surprising about it. The great thing is if one efficient and courageous person steps up and says, yeah, I'm for it. And Dennis was. In Duke, it started as a collective. Had it been down to me, Gay News would never have appeared, because as we were preparing it, first of all in my flat with my boyfriend, Peter Reed, and Dennis Lemon, just three of us in a small Soho flat. As we prepared it, I was moving away from journalism. I'd been a Fleet Street journalist for 10 years. And the impact of Gay Liberation Front was such that I wanted to experiment with living in communes. I wanted to find out what it was like to wear drag. I wanted to find out the whole array of things I'd never known. And though at the Times newspaper, where I was working at the time of the suggestion, I did wear coloured nail varnish to the slight bewilderment of the chairman of Shell on oil on one occasion. It was an era, early 1970s, when even the rather elderly and crusty were quite liking, on the whole, something new in place of what everybody had known for so long. So I'm there as news editor. Staff reporters Chris Kirk was a young man who wrote a very successful, good book called Men in Frocks, which was about drag, because though he didn't have any particular instinct for drag himself, he was fascinated by it. He went blind from HIV and died from HIV before there were sufficiently reliable, safe drugs to save his life. It was the early experimental treatments that made him blind. Jill Hanscom, wonderful Jill Hanscom, who lives in the West Country, was applied for a job. She had a young boy to raise, and she needed the money. She saw the advertisement, she applied for the job, and was given the job by Dennis as a staff reporter. The first time I'm aware of that a lesbian author had been given a news reporter's job at the paper. She was the author a year or two previously of Rocking the Cradle, an astonishing account, and I believe to be the first of lesbian motherhood and what you need to know and look out for, and in effect, how to cope. Contributing feature writer Peter Burton, he'd been a founder and editor of a magazine called Jeremy that came out some time before Gay News, but it was directly and exclusively aimed at gay men, and it was a fashion and lifestyle periodical. It was significant in the sense that it was nonetheless brave and courageous, and it was brought out in Carnaby Street in the centre of swinging London. Peter became an expert on the entertainment scene for LGBT people. And also, because he'd worked for Somerset Maugham's nephew, an author, he'd become more or less self-taught, as far as I'm aware, a literary critic. And so he did literary criticism for the paper. Some of the most significant people on the paper did not sign their names to any articles. And here, under production and diary of events and gay guide editor, colossally significant undertakings, is Jo Hodgkinson. And Jo is female Jo, not the male Jo. we'll come in a moment to just how significant the Gay Guide was in the Diary of Events. Art director Jean-Claude Thévenin, enchantingly in the very early days of preparing to launch Gay News, Denis Lemon went on a holiday in Paris and he fetched up with a young Parisian called Jean-Claude Thévenin, an artist, said to him, we're launching a periodical in London, why don't you come over? And so Jean-Claude did and stayed the entire length and life of the paper as an art director, and was joined in due course by Glenn Platz there underneath. I've never forgotten what Jean-Claude Thévenin said in 1983, which was just as the first rumors of this terrible illness were reaching us from America, AIDS, not then called AIDS. I have never forgotten what Jean-Claude Thévenin said when asked, what do you think awaits us all? And he said, it's going to be the beginning of one of the hardest times any of us have known. And intuited it. He had no more information than the rest of us. Staff photographer Bob Workman, still wonderfully with us, has recently donated his negatives for photographs he took in the course of nearly the whole of Gay News. He has donated all of them to, again, the Bishopsgate Institute in London, whose LGBT collections are getting larger all the time. It was obvious to all of us when he decided to do this a year or so ago that if he chose to, he could put the whole lot in storage and leave them to whatever he thought was an appropriate person or cause. And 50 years from now, Sotheby's or Christie's will be selling them for very large sums indeed, because they're unique. They are all unique. Then we had typesetting. Here's Claire Dennis and Wendy Simpson, who, unless I misunderstood very badly, were both lesbian. So that essential task of, though it was a different process then to what it would be today, that manual process of typesetting was done by women. We have advertising manager Sandy Murdoch here, classified ads Amanda Price. I better speed up a bit. On the top right-hand corner is Robert Palmer, who eventually owned Gay News for a while and at the time was the business manager. And Enid Scott Baker, assistant to the editor. The wonderful Enid Scott Baker was, as so many LGBT people are, was a devout Christian, but not a devout Christian of a discriminatory sort. And so cheerfully, as a woman in her late years, came to work as the secretary to the editor, to Dennis. Subscriptions, Leslie Jones, another woman. And there I better stop for now, I think, on the cast list. So shall we move on?
Okay.
I don't know what the world's coming to. Never mind Huddersfield. That was a pride event in Huddersfield. And the lovely thing you see on the right there, all the people who were on it, not all of them, but group after group after group. And the wonderful thing when we think about today is that the London organisers of Pride that year, 1981, said, we'll step aside, we won't hold a Pride event in London in order to encourage as many people as possible to go to the Huddersfield one. And I don't know of any such gesture of solidarity with the North in more recent years. So there we are. I don't know what the world's coming to, never mind Huddersfield. So where should we go next? Should we move on to another one? Mark Bunyan, pianist, songwriter, an extremely funny man, with us this evening. He's pictured here in 1981 at the piano, and on just below you can see an evening with Quentin Crisp. So those who remember Quentin Crisp, the stately homo of England, the first ever to receive that honour, he was still alive and still performing. So the lovely Mark Bunyan, still with us. So shall we move on again? Classified ads. Today, social media, then classified ads were a major source of revenue for gay news and a major source of finding somebody for people who were the readers. I ought to say briefly that about 20,000 people were purchasing gay news by the time of the issue we're looking at, and probably at least 5 times that would look at a copy. So we're talking about 100,000 or so people, including in Canada, where it was rather popular, and elsewhere in the world, but mainly outside England in Canada. The classified ads have a remarkable history, and a friend of ours called Stephen Dryden, who's at the British Library, is considering doing a special presentation at the British Library, provided everybody there agrees, on classified ads, because the British Library is a library, it's printed words, and it's a branch of printed words with an immense backstory. And I'll just mention one tiny bit of the backstory, which is that in the 1950s, when it was entirely illegal to have gay sex if you were male, and of course, the backwash hit lesbians, who were made even more closeted and unable to make public appearances, because the gay men were being victimized all the time by the police. In those years, the 1950s, when I myself was a late teenager and becoming in my 20s, the Sunday Times and the Spectator, 2 right-wing periodicals, as we put it today, at least small c conservative, and most of the time big C conservative, they would quietly run contact ads that were not only between men and women, but between men, as a way of libertarian right-wing protest against the state of the laws. And so here we have the upfront thing in an LGBT paper. There was a cartoonist called Tony Reeves at Gay News, who alas died a little while ago. And I've spoken with his sister fairly recently. Tony Reeves, being a cartoonist with a high sense of fun, one day decided to offer, it never went in, but to offer a classified ad that read as follows: I am 6'3" tall, a man, a surfer. I live in California. I have homes in Malibu and in Capri, and I have a spacious flat in London, in Hampstead. I just thought you'd like to know. So no box number. Thank you, Alan. This is one of the most moving of innumerable moving things that were printed in the paper. I think you can see, I'll just read a part of it. On Saturday, June 27, a lesbian celebration will take place in London, the one we heard of. I find myself in an appalling conflict of interests, which I'm sure very many women and men share. I am a teacher and a mother. I would like to support this celebration, and I think I should support it. because I want to protest against the possibility of losing my job and causing my child to suffer ostracism merely because I am what other people call a lesbian. Even if I didn't lose my job on account of coming out, my professional expertise would be questioned. I like teaching. In case I might be recognized because of photographs or television and then suffer fatal results in practicing my profession, I am unable to go. I am angry, sad, and depressed that the production and selling of weapons is publicly and politically acceptable, while the prejudices against the lesbian minority, which stands for life, love, wisdom, and honesty, are allowed full range. The majority protects these prejudices with hatred and contempt. In sadness and helpless anger, a lesbian reader forced to remain anonymous. Should we go on another moment? Gay News Literary Supplement. Well, we have with us today an editor of the Gay News Literary Supplement, Alison Hennigan, joining us from Cambridge, where she lives. The Gay News Literary Supplement became famous because so many top flight writers, not necessarily known to their readerships as LGBT, were and are LGBT. And in the literary supplement, their work could be discussed. Nobody was forced out of the closet, well, not deliberately, but their work could be discussed from the perspectives that they themselves wrote from. And this was a part of the paper. The number of pages got larger slowly as its success spread. This was the part of the paper that Dennis Lemon, as editor, was proud of every aspect of the paper. But this, in many ways, he was most surprised by and was proudest of. And he told me that Alison's achievement was one of the things he treasured most about the whole experience of running and creating such a paper. I don't believe he ever told Alison. As time went by, Dennis became, in the eyes of nearly everybody else, more and more unapproachable and tending to look grim. And that's been true of several editors I've known. And if they remained extremely cheerful, Fleet Street type ones, if they remained in Fleet Street cheerful, you knew you couldn't trust them 1 inch about anything. So that, of course, that face there, the wedding cake left out in the rain, it's W.H. Auden. So thank you very much, Alan. Just a few more of the paper. One of the consequences of all those male ads in the paper was, of course, that constant sense of this is a paper for men because of the ads. And yet it was not. There was a discussion between Dennis and women on the staff about devoting a part of the paper. To begin with, it was a couple of columns, something very restricted, and it got larger. And here's an example of it, The Visible Lesbian. It was prepared by the women on staff, regardless of what their named occupation was. So it wasn't prepared just by the writers on the staff. It was prepared by any and all of the women on staff who wished to share in it. And the most obvious thing to those of us who were cis men was that it just wasn't laid out the way the traditional kind of periodical and newspaper dominated by men is laid out. I can't quite prove it, but were you able to see any past copies and go through them? you'd see entirely what I mean. Suddenly, it's a different kind of page spread with a different kind of writing and content. So there it is. And The Visible Lesbian was chosen as the name for that very reason, that the invisibility of lesbians was constant and awful. And so what would you do? You'd call such a page The Visible Lesbian. This is our last photograph in this sequence, and we wanted to put it in because the first issue of Gay News came out during Gay Pride March 1972. And there were no distributors for years. No organizations would handle distribution of a paper called Gay News. It had to be done by hand or in the clubs or by subscription. And the first issues were sold by hand by the collective who were creating the first issue of Gay News. And they sold it at London Gay Pride March 1972, the first of the Pride marches, of which another is due this September in London. And there on the left, you can see the names. Ted Brown is on the left. He was about 20, something like that, and was writing for Gay News on Black issues, not as a member of the staff, but contributing to Gay News. And in the middle, I've been trying to find out in the interval who is in the middle, and I don't know. But on the right, somebody will probably get hold of me and tell me. And on the right is somebody most people have heard of. I do believe that's Peter Tatchell in 1972, saying homosexuals are revolting. And on the right, leaving with a cheeky photograph, is Ted Brown. And on the back of his bike, underneath the bum, is a copy of Gay News. If you had a magnifying glass, you'd see that it is. And he's giving us this wonderful smile. So thank you, everyone. If anybody has any questions or comments, do go ahead.
Right, thank you, Andrew. That was most interesting. Now, we've had a question come in about the 1977 blasphemy trial. And I believe Alison can tell us more about that.
Yes, thank you. Probably I can, because I didn't join Gay News until 1977, and I joined it just 2 weeks before the trial actually began. So the office was in a constant state of ferment as Dennis was preparing himself for what was going to be a very unpleasant time in court, and all sorts of fundraising activities were going on to pay legal costs. And it was a case which affected far more than gay people because the issues involved. The Criminal Blasphemy Act is a private act. It's not part of national legislation. It's something that got left on the statute books. And it's a very good reminder of why things shouldn't be allowed to clutter up the statute books, because a maligned person might think, well, hey, we could use this. And it was used by a woman called Mary Whitehouse, which will be a name altogether too familiar for some of you, perhaps not really very significant to younger people. But Mary Whitehouse was, and in many ways, a remarkable, for all the wrong reasons, person of formidable energy, the, in my view, wrong sort of Christian, who founded something called the National Viewers and Listeners Association. Her primary target was the BBC, but any whole range of activities or views or attitudes which she found inimical to her version of Christianity and social decency were her target. And she'd been looking for a way of going for gay people for some time, but all the targets she wanted to go to, her lawyers advised her, were too big and too powerful, and she'd lose. But Gay News, this little, small, tiny fledgling publication, that was a more gettable at target. And she decided to bring the case on the basis of a poem which the paper published by a not particularly good poet called James Kirkup, a literary academic doing most of his work in the universities of the Far East. But he published this poem which was about the centurion at the foot of Christ's cross during Christ's crucifixion. And it describes the crucifixion, and it describes the very passionate and intense feelings of love and desire which the centurion has for the figure of Christ. And then an act which is either a fantasized action of sexual activity with the dead Christ, or is indeed a supposed enactment of something which in this fictional world really happens. Anyway, this was the target to go for this poem. I don't think Mary Whitehouse had the slightest notion that this is actually a very old subject, that the subject of men, including straight men, whose feelings and devotion for Christ are frequently expressed in completely, totally erotic ways, is a long part of one particular section of Christian writing. And John Donne, for example, very famously says, "Batter my heart, three persons God," and ends by saying, I shall never be chaste unless thou ravish me." You know, that this is a very clear, violent graphic description that uses sexual love as the complete analogy for an overpowering, all-encompassing, desire-filled movement towards Christ. But I don't think those were the sorts of books that Mrs. Whitehouse read. So Dennis had to stand trial. A lot of people rallied to support him, people who were not gay at all, including E.G. Margaret Drabble, lots of people who wanted to stand up and be counted, because clearly the issues involved were not confined to gay people. There were issues of freedom of expression, and in an increasingly diverse world, an increasingly secular world, many people felt it entirely wrong that any religion should have any particular protected status before the law. And even if you were going to make a claim for that, it was only Christianity that was defended. It didn't do anything for Islam or Judaism or Hinduism or any of the other world religions. But anyway, was it even an appropriate piece of legislation to have available to be used by a private citizen, which was what happened. Dennis, in the end, was found guilty, but he was given a suspended sentence for 2 years. And I think a lot of people don't always realise that a suspended sentence doesn't mean that you have to be found guilty of performing the same alleged criminal action. Any sort of action which is criminal can activate the desuspension of that sentence. So this is a very horrible Damoclean sword to have hanging over you in that way. So Andrew knows better than I that the toll that it took on Dennis, and perhaps might want to say something about that in a moment. But it was a very astonishing time to be living through. And it was also interesting in that the gay community, which is as divisive, as quarrelsome, as fractious as any other human society. There's a lot of ill feeling, a lot of backbiting, and a lot of not very good behaviour from gay people going on. And there was, as Andrew's already mentioned, sometimes there's the divide, the lesbian gay male divide. And although a small number of people said, "Oh, sod it, I hate gay news, it's entirely capitalist, it's got nothing to do with revolution, it's all well-heeled white men thinking they can jet off to Mykonos for weekend breaks, bad cess tourism, and may they sink and die." Actually, when it looked as though the paper might indeed sink and die from a broadside fired by Mary Whitehouse and her like, actually people did pull together, and there was a massive fundraising effort to make sure we could meet our legal costs. So it's an exciting time and a thought-provoking time.
Right, thank you, Alison. Any other points you want to raise or to make, Andrew?
Yes, Alison mentions the impact on Dennis of that 1977 trial about the fundraising by the community with benefits and donations, including from Monty Python's Flying Circus, for those who recall that comedy series. The modern equivalent of what was raised is £250,000. Which isn't unprecedented these days for enterprises like creating a building, a centre. It was unheard of then for such a cause. Dennis was terrified of going to jail. Some people nobody wants to go to jail. Some people can nerve themselves for it. Dennis was terrified. And part of the reason he was terrified was that he was a very good looking man. He had a very beautiful face. And it was one of the stranger features of the prosecution that Mary Whitehouse, on behalf, as she thought, of Christ, was prosecuting somebody who looked like the white Western pictures of Christ. He thought he'd have a terrible time in jail because celebrity can protect you in jail, but he wasn't perhaps that kind of celebrity. And what everybody would know in a men's prison in England would be that he was a queer. He'd been sent because he was a queer, and there he was because he was a queer. At the end of the trial, some friendly and appalled Americans invited him to America and gave him as good a time as they possibly could. So he did get a party at the end of it, but it damaged him for life. And I knew him too within a few weeks of his death. Dennis died of HIV and is buried in a Christian churchyard in the West Country where he came from. And I think a film was made of the drama.
Yes.
So though I missed it, I believe there was a film, and Alison might know, within recent years.
The BBC did a documentary about the trial, which is at the moment available on YouTube. It just turned up. The algorithm threw it at me a few days ago. And I remember it being a rather good, sober, measured, decent, sane piece. So it's a sort of docudrama, in effect, of the trial. That might be the thing you're thinking of. You might be thinking.
Yes, it must be that. Yes. For anybody who wishes to know, Gay News is being digitized. The Gay News Archive project, I don't know the people who run it. I suddenly became aware some 2 years ago that they were doing it. The covers of Gay News, they started with issue 1, they look wonderful in electronic form. The colors look terrific. And I understand they're indexing, and they've done many issues, but I've not been attending for a while, so I don't quite know where things have got to.
That would be a terrific resource. Once that's available, that would be wonderful.
Yes.
Okay, so shall we end it there then? Thank you very much indeed for both of you for attending this today.
Thank you, Alan.
So,
It's been a great pleasure. Thank you.